Good evening, everybody. This is episode 9 of the Geoconservative Files. I'm Mr. Geocon here with a very special guest tonight, the Distributist. Say hello.
How's it going?
So, Distributist, I mean, most of us here, for most of us here, you need no introduction. You've run a very modestly successful channel.
Yeah, in the great scheme of things, it's pretty small. Let's be honest.
It is. I mean,
No,
it's
this is political YouTube. This isn't Logan Paul, right?
yeah, but if you narrow it down to reactionaries on political YouTube, you are pretty big. I mean, you rival Louis Leveau, who is one of the skeptics. So
Well,
I guess
he's kind of, he's always seems to be kind of hedging towards the Tucker Carlson side of things. I kind of expect him to move right over the course of time. And
I mean, he's already
vindicated that response. He's vindicated that prediction.
I mean, he's a Republican at this point. Who knows how long before he becomes conservative? But
who knows? In this, this is the thing. I mean, who knows? It's the way things are moving these days. The things we've seen in the last week would have never happened in America of any previous decade. It's impossible to imagine them happening in any previous decade. But here we are. So that is what it is.
Yeah, I would agree. And as much as I'd like to hear more of your take on some of this more serious stuff, I thought it would be nice to sort of take a step back and have talk about a bit more lighter fare, things like culture and art. Because when we're in the middle of all this stuff that's falling apart, we have to find something that's enjoyable. And I find that there is a sort of pleasure that one has in talking smack about some of the things that we hate. And I think you've mentioned in previous live streams about your dislike for some of these sorts of progressive pieces of entertainment, and the two that we're going to be discussing in this live stream are the very first Shrek movie and Steven Universe. So
it's funny. I mean, I'm going to be doing a trad codex, which is like a larger cultural analysis on Shrek. So I'll say what I have to say about it, but I imagine I'll be saying it in a lot more depth, probably in a few months' time.
Well, your fans can treat this as sort of a sneak preview. Maybe you could. Who knows? Maybe your discussion, saying things out loud here, will inspire more ideas for your future video. It's happened to me before.
I mean, I guess the thing is, with Shrek is I know I'm kind of dating myself, but it was an iconic movie of the of the sort of older millennial generation. I think it came out when I was in high school, and
2001.
It was considered, at the time, it was considered an edgy countercultural movie. And then over the course of the years between 2002 and 2012, the brand name Shrek went from being edgy counterculture to being the most mundane, plodding, standard type film. A Shrek film was a synonym for the low effort DreamWorks fare that has like 15 sequels, and that is just basically used to basically quiet kids down without having necessarily any very advanced plot. I guess the thing with Shrek is to my mind, it kind of characterized the 2002 to 2012 period, which is in many ways a period of time that I think is more important than people usually give it credit for. It's sort of it's a very hard to characterize era in American history. It doesn't seem to have one. It's not Clown World and it's not the 90s, but it's something in between. And and for that reason, it's very hard to characterize. But more than any other movie, I would say Shrek kind of embodied this era of culture. Uh, Everything about it originally was sort of designed to be edgy and and in hindsight, none of it looks edgy, right? Even at the time, the sort of infamous Smash Mouth soundtrack that now has become sort of a synonym for idiotic pop music inserted into kids movies. For the time, that was considered to be like really innovative and fresh. But now, and so I think that to my mind, that movie sort of stands out as being a little, like, kind of not, I would say cultural turning point might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly, you can't imagine that movie having the same impact or being the same kind of thing that it was before.
I mean, you said it in one. I mean, it was the very first Oscar winner in the animated film category. And I think what characterized the movie in my mind, and I heard it best in a recent YouTube video I watched called "Why" by Nerdstalgic, where he was talking about why Shrek is nearly perfect as a movie. And he says that it was a spoof. He characterized it as a spoof of the Disney fairy tale, propped up by grotesque humor. It subverts all the tropes associated with the genre. A disgusting, self-centered ogre rather than a pure-hearted hero or heroine as the protagonist. A decidedly uncute talking animal sidekick. A villain who's not some menacing schemer, but kind of a loser, and an overall subversion of the clean-cut morals, sort of edgy. In short, it's the DreamWorks version of a Disney movie for a generation of kids and adults who grew up with Disney movies and now wanted to see those worlds go up in flames.
Well, but the thing is, none of that is true. I mean, it's all lies. The fractured fairy tale that we're talking about when we talk about Shrek was not something that was new to Shrek. We've been making them. I mean, I'll just give you the whole word "fractured fairy tale" comes from Rocky and Bullwinkle, which was a cartoon that aired, I think, in the early '60s. I think in the early '60s, yeah. And so these things, fractured fairy tales had been an element of American culture for years and years and years. And Shrek was only copying. He was only trying to ride those coattails with some slight modifications. The innovation about Shrek was that how self-congratulatory it was in doing that. It was an incredibly self-righteous movie. It was also an incredibly hateful movie in the sense that largely it was constructed by Katzenberg and Spielberg as a giant F you to Disney. I mean, and it's less like a war for the small guys, and it's much more. I think the much more appropriate way to look at it is just we wanted our way the first time, and Disney didn't give it to us, so now we're taking our revenge on them. I mean, that's not revolutionary to me. That's just a rivalry between multimillionaire media corporations, and it was played off as if it was some kind of revolution. And I don't know. This is the thing with these things. Is I think nothing about the narrative Shrek had for itself was true. And this kind of came out in later films. There's no way to talk about Shrek without realizing that it was from the beginning a thoroughly mainstream film posing as something that was edgy and slightly countercultural. And it really exposed how much of the sort of edgy 90s countercultural movement was actually just sort of wormed over corporate culture.
I think that's so. What would you say is the sort of the reactionary or right-wing critique of the Shrek movie as a movie outside of
Um,
this sort of larger context.
I don't know if it really is a reactionary critique. I think that's the wrong way. I think it's just telling. I mean, you can critique Shrek just by honestly describing what it is, as I just did. Right? It's a revenge project, built by very, very rich movie producers to get back at other very, very rich movie producers. But in that moment, they felt like they were sticking it to the man, so they retrofitted a common, a very common mode of culture, which was the inverted fairy tale, which had, like I said, been popular at least since the 50s and was very popular in the 90s. And they kind of stuck a little bit of an alternative flair on it, and that worked. That the narrative of that sold in the 90s. The narrative of that did not sell or could not be sold in the 2000s, and it certainly didn't sell after 2012. So I think just describing what it actually is I don't think there's anything that's original or cute about it. I am, maybe I'm in a minority in this regard, but to my mind, it's a paint by numbers. The princess is not that different from other princesses in Disney movies in the 90s. I mean, I guess she might be different if you were to like transport her to 1955. But the movie wasn't released in 1955. It was released in 2001. So as such, what was the princess's name? Fiona. She's more or less just like Mulan or Princess Jasmine with a little bit more crude humor. And then like the non-inversion that they have in the end, where they both become ogres. I mean, we've seen it before. I believe that again, this was done in the Rocky and Bullwinkle show for several of their fractured fairy tales. It's a common inversion of the trope. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I would say about it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that is, I do have a problem with that particular thing, that's particular inversion, because when I was watching the Nerdstalgic, I had that Nerdstalgic. I had this feeling like everything he praised about Shrek was something that I found revolting. For instance, and the number one thing that I found revolting was that sort of inversion that you say that has been around for quite some time. Uh, he says that it made Shrek more consistent than contemporary Disney movies like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, because in Beauty and the Beast the message was love has no face, but it's undermined by the beast transforming into a handsome prince. And if the message of Aladdin is love has no class, then that's undermined by Aladdin becoming a prince at the end of the movie. But by contrast, Fiona doesn't end the movie a beautiful princess, but an ogre.
Yeah, but that's the same message with a different face on it, right? I mean, it's basically, it's like the standard, this is like the affirmative action woke idea that, if you take what was low and make it high, then you fundamentally change the message, but you haven't, right? It's still two people who look like each other getting married. And the only thing you do is you take the normal looking people and put them on bottom, and you take the abnormal people and put them on top. But the fundamental structure of the story isn't any different. And so it's not accurate that this is. I mean, love has no face. If you want to be truly non-hypocritical, you'd make them actually look ugly, and neither Shrek nor the Beast look ugly. So there's that problem. But you'd have the woman or the man stay with the love, even though that there was a huge asymmetry in appearance. And none of the movies in this genre really have that. I'm trying to think back to something like Phantom of the Opera, something that a more mature genre convention, Cyrano de Bergerac or something like that. I don't know exactly if the trope is ever inverted quite that perfectly, but if you wanted to invert it perfectly, that's what it would have to be. The idea that they both end up as ogres is, like I said, it's like the affirmative action solution. It's like, let's do what we were doing before, but have a different face as the face of our power structure. So it's fundamentally not revolutionary for that reason. Also, I mean, the evaluation is kind of stupid. I mean, Beauty and the Beast, I think is going to be an entertainment classic. Whereas I think Shrek is going to be remembered as an artifact from the early 2000s that is not going to be seen as, it's going to seem very, very dated in hindsight. The CGI is going to look dated. It already does look dated. And certainly the pop soundtrack that they were so praised for in the 90s will look very, very dated as well.
So you would say that it's kind of fitting then that Shrek is considered a meme, kind of a joke, because of how dated and trashy. Like nobody sincerely likes Shrek, except maybe this nostalgic guy.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to say no one sincerely likes it. I imagine people who were much younger than me when they saw it, when it came out in 2001, people who were older liked it because they picked up on that this was some kind of revolutionary statement about Disney and about the fairy tale. It wasn't. But I imagine if you grew up with this, like a lot of the younger millennials, and you were a young kid when you saw it, you might interpret it in a very, very different way. I would certainly say that this characterized very much how culture evolved in the 2002 to 2012. It was time after time sort of taking properties that had been considered fringe or nerd and then transitioning them into a mainstream product for consumption. And this was the formula of the 2000s and early 2010s. And that really was what Shrek was one of the earliest iterations of. And I think most of these things, when we look back on them, another example might be Scott Pilgrim versus the World, V for Vendetta, or Kick-Ass, all of which were sort of fringe comics in the 90s or early 2000s, and all which got made into very mainstream movies. They all have the same kind of attitude where they tell a very common story, but they just make the nerds on top, and they don't actually challenge any of the genre conventions. So it ultimately does not seem lasting in any meaningful way, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say that's something that was. Oh gosh, the rain outside. Let me just move this away from the window. So, what I would say to that, what you would say is it's something that was. It's one of those things where it's like the old man and who has the hat on backwards and the skateboard. He's like, "Hey, fellow kids, look how rad I am."
Well, and that's what Shrek feels like now, and I think that's what a lot of the Shrek sequels feel like as well. I don't know. I didn't see any Shrek sequels after 2, but Shrek 2 felt incredibly forced, in my opinion, and I can only imagine what subsequent iterations felt like. I don't know. I think that seems to be the attitude of most more modern people. Now, there might be people who are from more mainstream circles, and in particular, I'm thinking of mainstream progressive circles, who think that Shrek is, this revolutionary piece of media that created our present culture, and in many ways, it's true, it did. I think it set our culture on a trajectory, and it didn't set the trajectory, but it indicated a change of trajectory in our culture that was fundamentally bad and destructive.
You mean like it's directed towards, a superficial subversion of the norms?
Yeah.
That's pushed by large corporations with lots of money.
Yeah, superficial subversions of the norms that present themselves as breaking new ground and being some kind of huge deviation for how things ordinarily operate. But if you scratch the surface, you'll see the same machinations. I mean, Shrek was not made by an indie studio who wanted to get back at Disney. Shrek was made by Spielberg and Katzenberg, which were, like, again, two very, very, very established producers who had already launched DreamWorks Studio. And so it was not by any stretch of the imagination an indie affair, but it wanted to present itself as the rebel, and that's ultimately what it was trying to sell itself as.
Well, now, if you really want to see something that was really pushed, Steven Universe is definitely something that was very much pushed by the mainstream. Even if you think that Shrek is revolutionary, you can't really deny that Steven Universe is like a mainstream children's entertainment.
Yeah.
It gets this glowing praise. It has 100% perfect rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Well, I'm kind of curious what you had to think about Steven Universe, because I've only seen the first season.
Oh gosh. Well, it does. Well, first of all, what I would say is the only thing that changes is that it has this pretension to an overall mythology, and to a certain extent it does. It tries to create what it's trying to do with its plot is it tries to have like a monster of the week type setting while also having an overarching story that comes to a head at the end at certain climactic points.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess that's a good summary for the audience. I mean, well, I guess to elaborate on it, Steven Universe was produced, and I think it's also directed by Rebecca Sugar, who was, who was a director and a writer for one of the few modern animated shows that I genuinely like, Pendleton Ward's Adventure Time, which I will defend Adventure Time. I think it's a very good show. But Steven Universe wanted to take the Adventure Time formula of whimsical animation, where you take very, very simple character designs and you kind of combine them with imaginative settings. Rebecca Sugar's vision, and again, this is coming from somebody who's seen the first season, was to sort of explicitly combine this with progressive politics and implicitly coded LGBT themes that are, I say implicitly coded, but I mean, for any adult who watches this show, it's about as implicit as getting hit over the head with a 2x4. It is very, very obvious that it's a stand-in for alternative lifestyle themes. I guess when I asked what your opinion was on Steven Universe, I was asking for more of your evaluation of it.
Well, the first thing I would note about it is that it's very much critically acclaimed, and you have to wonder why sometimes, because unlike you, I'm not. Maybe it's just me, because unlike you, I did not like Adventure Time, and especially I did not like its animation, and that sort of cal art style, as it's called. And Steven Universe seemed to be sort of the worst, have like the worst aspects of the cal art style, and yet its art is one of the main things that gets praised, because it's supposedly beautiful, but the characters just look ugly to me.
Well, I mean, since we're sort of on the technical side of things, the cal art style is, I mean, it's definitely influenced by anime. And the idea is that you save your budget on character. So most of the motion in your animated show comes from the character. So you make the character really, really, really basic. And then you use the rest of your animated budget to get that character to go really interesting places and experience plots that are very, very atypical. So Adventure Time always had very simple, very, very simple, like Saturday. I mean, I'm talking like, your syndicated funny page type of animation characters. And then it juxtaposed them on these sort of more creative vistas and weird adventures. So, I mean, I can totally understand someone not liking that. You're looking, most of the time you spend looking at a character that's not very well designed. I know that Steven Universe has been criticized for not having very consistent character designs, which breaks from the pattern of the Cal Arts idea. So I guess that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I guess most people who talk about Steven Universe usually comment on its implicit politics, right? I don't. I guess I don't think the Cal Arts style is inherently bad. I guess I understand why people don't want everything to look like Cal Arts style.
And I'm someone who sort of likes the you know I'm someone who used to like anime a lot, not as much anymore. But one of the appeals of anime was always that even if the character designs were very simple, they didn't look ugly to look at. It didn't look like it didn't look like there was some kind of hideous mutation in the characters.
Well, that's a difference between Adventure Time and Steven Universe. In Adventure Time, I felt like the characters were simple. In Steven Universe, it felt like they were intentionally oblong.
Mm. Yeah,
you get the same sense.
yeah, I do get the same sense. I mean, Adventure Time was like one of the things about Adventure Time was that a lot of the characters were very skinny, skinny, and while the Steven Universe characters were very not skinny, especially Steven. And
which is unusual too, right? That's actually, now we're getting to the more interesting aspects of Steven Universe, right? Because, comparing, and I don't want to go to Adventure Time because I know that you didn't want to talk about it, but Finn the Human is or Finn Mertens, the main human character in Adventure Time, is a very, very standard boy adventure hero. He's an adventure hero that I think everyone in times past would have understood as being an adventure hero. Whereas Steven Universe is not in any way. Steven from Steven Universe is, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, like, there is no way that I, as a child, would have found Steven from Steven Universe to be a role model that would have really captured my imagination, no matter what kind of adventures he went on. Because, well, it's amazing because I think that people actually admit this. He's incredibly emotionally weak, at least for the first few seasons. I don't know if this ever changes, and not sort of in like the Frodo Baggins way, where he could visibly get stronger, but just in sort of a very, very strange way where it seems that he is always sort of on the back foot, and for me, it was something that was very distracting. It was really distracting. That entire the character of Steven Universe.
I would say that Steven got stronger as a character more towards the end when he was questioning his own identity, because for those of you who do not know, Steven Universe is his own mom, and yes, that is weird. It's a weird alien thing. I don't know why they chose to do it that way, but it did make for some really weird and interesting drama towards the end about who am I really? Am I really lying to myself about what I am? But
the question, and this is sort of, Steven Universe is a feminist coming of age story for a boy. And for me, it's very, very difficult to imagine Steven Universe growing up into a man who at all has qualities that are stoic or heroic in any way. He seems like he'll grow up to be like a hippie or something, or have some kind of non-binary, explicitly non-masculine identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because when they show him being like at the end of Steve at the end of by the end of the series, he does become like a more traditionally masculine looking guy, But it's just so I think it's just so at odds with like the trajectory of what someone like Steven in real life would end up unless they rejected feminist ideology.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I guess one of the things that that struck me about Steven Universe. Well, I mainly watched clips of it on YouTube all the time, and maybe that's what it was built for, because a lot of these modern shows are built for YouTube. You just they put like 5-minute clips of the episodes on YouTube scattered around, and then you watch them, and that gets you hyped for the show. And there's all these reaction YouTubers who they see that are all over emotional. They see this new episode, this new reveal of Steven Universe, and they go, "Oh, that's so cool!" And the fans make all these theories of like, all these theories of like, who is this, who is that, all this speculation, and but the writers, and this is something that writers do a lot. It's they nowadays they look a lot of the writers look at like the fan speculation of what's going to happen, and then they're like, yeah, you know what, in order to appease the fans, we're going to take one of the popular fan theories and we're going to put that into the show, so that later on it'll be revealed that, for instance, Steven's mom is actually Pink Diamond. Spoiler
Well,
alert.
I'd have to see how that works. I think, oftentimes I know writers these days have been accused of coming up with worse theories than their fans themselves would come up with. So I don't know if I'm ready to speculate on exactly how they came up with the twists. Like I said, I've only seen the first season of the show. I never actually talked to a young kid that likes Steven Universe. I only ever seem to meet not even, I think I maybe met one man who likes Steven Universe. It's usually women who like that show.
That is true. I mean, I see a lot of that, and it's kind of I don't think it was actually that popular with kids. I heard that it had such poor ratings that they had to have these long hiatuses to artificially boost the TV ratings so that could avoid being canceled, because they did not want to cancel the first ever animated series created solely by a woman, which is like one of their main narratives about this series. It's great because it was made entirely by a woman.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to avoid us getting into the weeds of like how Steven Universe was created, because I just don't know how Steven Universe was created. Like, I'll take your word for it, right? As insofar as what it represents in our culture, it's definitely a break from the Shrek theme of faux revolutionary qualities. Steven Universe you couldn't imagine Steven Universe being produced in the 2000s. It's too explicitly political. It's too obviously explicitly political. So it's definitely an artifact of the post 2012 world. But aside from that, I'm not exactly sure what else to say about it.
I would say that one of the things that I found interesting about the political side of things and its plot is how it this might be surprising, but how it's explicitly pro biolinguist. And I say this because
it's hard to be explicitly and pro an ideology that the authors probably don't know exists. But I think what you mean is that it has themes that a reactionary might associate with the theory of bioleninism.
Well, let me explain to you how this happened. You see, the main antagonists in the series, the Homeworld gems, are they have their society is like an imperialistic space empire that has a racial caste system that is ruled over by god empresses.
Mhm.
And they and it's and one of their main and one of the main things that the antagonists repeatedly attack Steven and the crystal gems for is how Steven, by not making these crystal gems conform to the society of the homeworld, Steven is in some way indulging in their flaws and using those flaws to prop up his own ego and prop up himself so that he'll be the best of the worst. And this line of criticism is repeated by several different antagonists throughout the series. And the way that Steven conquers these enemies is he usually uses some kind of Deus ex machina, and then he's able to show that the bad guys are actually just as flawed as the good guys, and then the bad guys either self-destruct or they become good guys, and that's usually what happens. And I found that it's like looking in a mirror and seeing it's basically as if the writer. I don't know if the writers have ever even. I don't think the writers have ever heard of bioleninism, like
I
you said.
bet they haven't.
But it's almost like
fringe internet theory that comes from the right wing. There's no way the writers ever heard of that.
Of course, but it's almost like they. But I mean, if somebody were to come up with like bioleninism, explicit bioleninism, and then say, yes, this is actually a good thing, they would make something like Steven Universe and have that kind of conflict between the heroes and the villains, is what I would be saying. That's what I'm saying.
Hmm. Well, I mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, I feel like in a lot of progressive media, you could make a similar critique. The quote unquote bioleninism idea is something that really could be applied to a lot of modern progressive ideas. They do have sort of this idea that it's a revolt against the people who've been lording over us all of these years. Something.
Yes. I would definitely agree. I'm seeing Macropod in the comments asking if we're still talking about a child's cartoon. Yes, we are talking about a child's cartoon, but we're talking about the politics of a child's cartoon. One last question I would have for you on Steven Universe is what would you say, to summarize, what would you say Steven Universe tells us about the Steven Universe phenomenon tells us about modern society?
Well, I mean, it tells us that radical feminism is mainstream, but I think everyone already knew that, right? I mean, Steven Universe is sort of a very unsurprising piece of work to come out of this time. It's only surprising when you realize that it couldn't have been made in any other time.
Yeah, Lex says revolt against the pre-modern world.
I don't know what that means. What does he mean by that?
These progressives are revolting against the pre-modern world.
Well, I mean, I guess they're revolting against reality. Maybe they would agree with that.
I would say so.
It's always hard to say with these things. I mean, it's hard to say with these things. It's
I would say that one of the things that you notice with a lot of these types of progressives is that when you say it's reality, they would say it's a result of like some kind of social system that's oppressing them.
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, it's like it's almost as if they imagine the world was like the homeworld of Steven Universe, where everything was designed, including the gem's own nature, was designed to fulfill the needs of a imperialistic caste based empire, uh, and that genocides people. You know, it's sort of that
I mean,
sort of.
that's sort of the classic like Harry Potter thing, where the only evil that a progressive can imagine is like some iteration of Adolf Hitler.
Or in this case, it's almost like Adolf Hitler meets the God Emperor of Dune, except they're all lesbians.
Sure. I'm not so sure how much I can comment on the details of later season revelations of Steven Universe, because of the fact that I don't, I only know the show from my. I mean, I know vaguely what it is, and I've studied what people say about it on the left side of the culture war, but other than that, I don't have any great knowledge of it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of this sort of. So I think what you said about what it will say about this. One last thing about this is, you've said before that the solution to bad art is good art, and and that's the other thing that we wanted that I wanted to talk about on this live stream. What would you, you've talked a lot about the need for art on the dissident right. I know that one of the people that have inspired you, Curtis Yarvin, wrote an article in the American Mind about this very topic, where he said that the only reliable way to change a regime is to impress it into surrendering of its own will. The world cannot be won by force; it must be seduced by greatness.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's accurate. But this, the obvious problem is, you can't just command good art to come down from the heavens, and talking about it doesn't really make it. I mean, being a cultural critic, I think, gets you some way towards producing art, but really, if we're honest about this, I mean, the only thing we can do is make what we think we can do, and we're certainly not going to. I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like I'm like on the verge of releasing a Dostoevsky novel in my life. That's not anything that I can do. So we're kind of in this position where, yes, art is the thing, and we need to create a culture of that through criticism and through minor works. But the problem is that art does not move to the command of any critic. It's not like politics that way.
That is something rather strange. I mean, you would think that art would follow the lead of some kind of authority, but
Why?
why? Because it seems like just about everything else in our society seems to work from the top down.
Oh yeah, I mean art. Well, okay, but I mean, in the sense, you're right, in the sense that you get the style of art that the patrons pay for, but you don't get, you can't command great art to come down, right? The goodness of the art is, for everything else that is bullshit. I would say a certain amount of what isn't bullshit is a certain amount of realism over what is art, or what creates good art. And what creates good art are people who actually possess genius inside themselves. You can't just a king can say, I want realist art, but he cannot command a Dostoevsky into an existence.
So that's what you would see as the primary difficulty, is that there isn't really. We're just sitting. It seems like we're sitting around waiting for an artistic genius to become a reactionary.
Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, you're kind of putting a bit of a fine point on this. I don't wait around for anything, but we can talk about art that exists that we like. We can talk about art we're producing or that our friends have produced. I know that my friend Franklin has finished a novel that he read on this channel, and while I have a hard time picking up fiction in audio form, we obviously need more of that. The difficulty right now is that the creative class and the creative class of people is not very friendly to right-wing ideas. So I can say that we need to have more focus on the culture and hope something grows out of that. I'm not so sure. Well, I mean, maybe you could ask me a more specific question on this. Don't wait around for genius. What you want to do is you want to do the best thing that you can do in your own life. That's how it always works, right? But at the same time, you cannot, by power, mandate the creation of some amazing piece of art. You can fund it, but unfortunately, and this is the reality, is that modern right-wing movements have never had a large amount of budget that's been dedicated towards the commissioning of art. And that's because almost all of their budget gets put into guarding against progressive advances in other domains. So they're kind of like the Soviet Union that way. It all gets put into defense, and nothing gets ever put into R&D.
So what you would say then is we would create a sort of culture that would make right-wing ideas more appealing to artists. And I mean, I've seen,
but by creating culture, let's be clear about this. We mean like a bunch of people who are making stuff. That's all that an artistic culture really means.
Yes, I actually did. I actually was inspired by there was a certain anime critic named Digibro, and he's kind of a left-wing guy, but he has some interesting ideas every now and then. And one of the things that he's complained about amongst anime fans is how he notices how there is all this crap coming out, and it's all and what gets popular, it seems to be entirely determined by search engine optimization and corporate money. If it's popular on Twitter, it's that's what everybody talks about.
No, I'll take your word for it.
And he would say that the main reason why is, if there's something that's more underground that's really good, there's not a community that's talking about it. And his solution was to just try to create a community, starting with himself and some friends of his, that just sit around and talk about what's sort of underground, what's sort of not put into our faces by large corporate money.
I mean, that's worthwhile to do, right? That's worthwhile to do. It's worthwhile to create criticism spaces and spaces that underline indie culture. If there is going to be things that break with mainstream progressive ideology, they're going to come out of indie culture communities. They're not going to come out of the mainstream. The difficulty we're having right now is, I think that I'd say even though there is an indie community that is right wing, it is still overwhelmingly left wing. And so as such, I think that what you, as a right winger, you don't have anything that you have hope that the small dissident right faction is going to generate more art and more counterculture. But even now, with, I think, an upswing in youth right wing attitudes, it's still nothing compared to the left.
I mean, we've seen but I would say that the main way to sort of create this sort of space is to find some kind of niche that the artistic left is not able or willing to fulfill, that could see some kind of demand. What would you say is one of
That
those
I
niches?
think that is, you hit the nail on the head. That is the vulnerability they open up, and the niche is that the left does not like anything that isn't saccharine sweet romanticism, right? This has been a weakness, and this is one of the reasons why I don't like anime, is that it's saccharine and sweet and overly romantic, which I think is the death of art. I think that great art has to have a tragic dimension, and it has to be at least somewhat realist or somewhat gothic. Pure romanticism is trash, and or it's readily recognized as trash by people who consume things more seriously. And because of this, I think there are spaces open up. The problem is that the problem is if right wing entertainment is going to have to go for deeper and darker themes. I think contesting over things like anime is going to be difficult, because anime is just the kind of saccharine fare that is going to be quite popular among leftists, and its ideas are going to dominate towards the left. I know I've talked to Arjun Templar and a variety of other people about anime. I used to like anime in high school. The word weeb didn't really exist at that point. The word was, I think, otaku, before it got its negative connotations. But I was an anime fan then, and I look back on it, and I look back at the people who were anime fans, and I compare them to people who liked rap and Eminem and all the stuff that I thought was crude. And in high school, the people who like anime they're all consuming these products that depict traditional relationships, and they oftentimes have they have steampunk aesthetics, so they have a highly Victorian aesthetic quality to them. And then you fast forward 15 years into the future, and all of the anime fans are in these gay relationships, or the transgender, or they're radically feminist, and all of the people who liked rap and sports, they're all more of your standard issue conservatives or moderates. The symbolism used in anime is traditionalist, but the mode of its communication over beauty is saccharine and romantic, and therefore it appeals to the very thing that people kind of rightfully complain about, or that attracts leftists, I should say.
So, what would you say is an example of something that is? I mean, if you were to point to something that you'd say is just what the opposite of this kind of saccharine sweet, or at least a subversion of that, what kind of features would it have?
I mean, so we're kind of going back, and I probably will make a video on this eventually. We're kind of going back to the problem of the romantic movement, and would eventually let it to be, in many ways, cut back. Pure romanticism artistically sucks. Because it's a lie, and so the ways to solve it have usually been to incorporate elements of tragedy, or to incorporate highly realistic elements. If you look at the romantic novels of the 19th century, the anecdotes to kind of insultingly romantic 19th century novels was the introduction of things like George Eliot or Dostoevsky, what we would call now the realist school of fiction. And I think that oftentimes, either introducing a tragic dimension or a realistic dimension, those are going to be two things that are resisted by the left very definitively. And so that might be a direction for the right to go in. But if you're actually doing this right, if you're actually creating art, you're not going to start it with a checklist going oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. You're going to create a you're going to try to make a more You're just going to tell a story, right? But I think one of the things we have to always be aware of is that a story has to have some dimension to it that actually speaks truly to human existence. And in many ways, that is what the sort of Steven Universe and other romanticism escapades that exist in anime, it's what they've never been able to do properly.
You mean speak true to true realistic experiences?
Yes.
I mean, if I look at like, if I want to look for like something that's gritty, as an anime, like something like
I didn't say gritty. Gritty is not what I'm talking about.
Gritty. Could you?
Gritty is not what I'm talking about.
Could you?
I said tragic, or I said tragic, or it has to have a realist component to it. Not gritty is what we do when we're trying to, not come to terms. Like something like Flannery O'Connor. Are you aware of Southern Gothic?
I am not aware of
or Cormac McCarthy or any of those authors.
I'm not.
Those are two Gothic authors that subvert commonly romanticized elements of fiction.
Okay.
Going. I mean, what genre are you familiar with that I can kind of take this in?
I actually do not read a lot of fictional works nowadays, to be honest.
Okay. It's hard to go to anime because this is sort of something that's distinctly absent in anime. I mean, Graveyard of Fireflies is realist. I mean, that's an example of realist anime. It's almost too realist, to be quite honest. And I agree that like Evangelion, and as I'm seeing someone in your thing, Evangelion does have tragedy to it, but it also what's lacking in Evangelion is not the tragic dimension, but like a point. any kind of reflection on deeper human nature. Typically, tragedy is supposed to expose something deeply human about the dilemma the hero faces. Evangelion has tragedy in that it tugs at your heartstrings, but the problem is that it ends up in a place that's kind of very much removed from human experience, which makes it a perfectly fine science fiction novella, but it doesn't really, I don't know really what that tells us. And I mean, I could go more into Evangelion if I wanted to, right? I have huge critiques of Evangelion.
Well, what I would,
you couldn't do something that looked like Evangelion, but Evangelion, I can tell you exactly where that anime fell down.
Well,
and what's funny about that too is that Evangelion that movie was old when I was into anime in the early 2000s, which is ridiculous when you think about it.
I mean, what I would say about Evangelion is the reason why it didn't have a point. It was because the author who wrote it did so while he was quite frankly mentally ill. He was suffering from depression, and the studio that was making the show had a kind of a shoestring budget, which led to a nonsensical ending.
Well, I actually, believe it or not, the nonsensical ending isn't the main problem. The main problem is the characters. The main problem is that Shinji. I mean, it tells it tells for the first half of Evangelion, it's an incredibly juvenile story, right? Like. It's a main male character who really does nothing except feel sorry for himself, and we're sort of asked to feel sorry for himself with him. Now, I understand that the author is trying to communicate some kind of advanced state of depression, and that is what it is. But then it seems like the movie kind of wants to have this juvenile story of the underappreciated young man who's secretly liked by all these attractive girls and like saves the world constantly, but he's never appreciated by his father. It wants to have that story go on with like a deep psychological examination of the character. A deep psychological examination of the character would have to come to some pretty hard observations about Shinji, and not just like the hard observations that are dealt with at the end of that anime series. It would have to go a lot deeper than that. And I think it would be a lot less entertaining to go in that direction. But the question is Evangelion like a work of entertainment, like a stupid sci-fi movie, or is it trying to be some kind of like deep work of psychological science fiction? And I think it needs to choose one or the other. The mixing up peas and carrots means that it's a compromised work in my book. But that's not the problem. The problem with anime in particular is that and this is something that's only been getting worse since the 90s. It manifestly refuses to try to go in these deeper directions. It's only comfortable with a type of tragedy that remains entertainment tragedy. And it never wants to go to anything that is challenging to the audience. And I think that the reason why a lot of these anime fans ended up being feminists is, I think feminist is where you end up if you're a person who doesn't want to intellectually challenge themselves and you grow up in a progressive community.
I would say that you do have a good point, because I remember reading an essay talking about the history of anime and the politics behind it. And the very early anime was that the very first anime that was considered or that was political was made by leftists, but a very different type of leftist that you wouldn't see. It was more like the hardline economic classical Marxist leftists. They were part of a movement called the Zankyoto, which basically the left in Japan went the opposite direction from the left in America, in that instead of moving towards cultural politics, it doubled down on sort of the economic hardline Marxist materialist direction.
Well, sure, and Japan could do that because it was essentially a military protectorate of the United States.
And
you'll see similar stories in Europe too, but ultimately it doesn't matter, because all culture will eventually, unless it's explicitly aligned as countercultural against the establishment, all culture will eventually start orbiting around what comes out of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, what you notice is later on, you had it. I mean, later on, these authors started more or less adopting a sort of nihilistic consumerist view, and that infected all of their work, essentially leading to this kind of non-challenging stuff where you are basically asked to indulge in a childish fantasy, and that is the and so a lot of modern anime nowadays, the way that it works is you find some trashy web novel on the internet that's basically a fan fiction that's very self-referential of other web novels, and then you take that, make it into a light novel, which is essentially Japan's version of an airplane novel, and then you take that and make it into a manga and an anime, and they keep doing this, and they have like 50 of those every season.
Yeah, and so it's recycled fan fiction, basically, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like fan fiction is both not rightly and rightly criticized. I mean, it's criticized for the wrong reasons. Fan fiction itself, the idea of taking someone else's character and doing a story based on them, it's something that people did for the longest time. Most of Shakespeare's plays are revised and reworked stories that come from elsewhere. And they're really terrible in their original version too. So there's, but obviously the existence of copyright law means that those fan fiction works, even if they were at the level of Shakespeare, they could never get off the ground without so much reworking that it would almost not be worth it to start there to begin with. The other problem though with fanfic, and the reason why we can't just say like, oh, fanfic is this fertile ground for creative endeavors. The problem is that fanfic indulges the worst aspects of storytelling. it indulges. I mean, basically, there's a reason why fan fiction tracks into pornography very frequently. That's because it's, I mean, fan fiction, most fan fiction and most pornography is doing the same kind of thing. It's creating scenarios that are meant to titillate an audience with the minimal amount of effort. And it never and you know, when you pick up most fan fiction that you're never going to get something that challenges you. And this is something that I think that, you know, anime generates this culture and it feeds off of it. And what you just described to me seems to indicate that it's in some kind of feedback loop with that culture.
Definitely, it's like a self-reference. Like there's an entire genre called In Another World, which is essentially it's essentially the same type of story as John Carter of Mars. You know, you have the hero who is taken from our world and placed into some fantasy world and given superpowers, and he goes out and wins all the babes. I mean, Edgar Rice Burroughs did it better in the 1920s. People.
Yeah, and then Pulp Fiction has an incredibly pornographic aspect to it. And yet I think Pulp Fiction is a much more fertile ground for exploration. And I guess, you know, I talked about Fritz a little bit about this. I mean, I guess it's a good comeback to my thought on why anime is so compromised. I guess my thought on Pulp Fiction was that, you know, Pulp Fiction, the advantage it had was that it was the creation of one person's mind, and it didn't in animation by necessity can't be. So animation is going to take like the smallest possible risks imaginable. And so I'm sure that there were Pulp Fiction writers who were shit, and, you know, we remember Burroughs and Howard and Lovecraft, like those to our mind are the Pulp Fiction writers, but we're just getting like the creme de la creme. But what made so much difference to Pulp Fiction in that era was that anybody could write a Pulp Fiction novel and have it published. You got paid by the word. So Lovecraft, who could like barely afford food, was able, and Howard, who was like, you know, I think he was a high school dropout actually. They could have these prolific careers as authors, and they didn't care. And so you had these people who came from walks of life who would never get published in any other context actually get to tell their stories. And I don't think the same thing is true for anime. I don't think that anime is the way for people who would never get heard of to get their voices heard. Well, I would say that if you something that looked like fanfic, but that wasn't so tightly wed to. The problem with fanfic is that the fact that you're using someone else's characters means that you, by definition, can never circulate it legally without a direct lawsuit from the company. And that was the exact opposite case as Lovecraft and Howard dealt with. They were dealing with a situation where they could get it circulated legally. And because of that, you know, I love to see a genre of media where people could cut their teeth at doing original works of fiction and imagination, but I'm not so sure where to start with that exactly.
I think that you're hitting the nail on the head here. Although I would say that there are a lot of anime where they just take like a random webcomic artist's work and turn it into an anime. For instance, there's this one guy, I forgot what his name was. I think his name was One, and he made two different web comics that became these these really popular cultural sensations. Called one was called One Punch Man, and the other is called One Punch Man and Mob Psycho 100, and both of those are kind of interesting, though they're both sort of like these. I mean, One Punch Man is just a parody of the superhero genre, and Mob Psycho 100 is kind of a coming of age type of story, except with psychic powers.
There's something implicitly wrong with anime. I want to say that for your chat. There's something like about anime itself. The problem is that the money-making mechanism of anime the problem with anime is that the money making. And I don't, even with Evangelion, like I don't doubt that like the author had this great story about depression that he wanted to tell through a story of like robots and aliens. That sounds like a great idea. The problem is that in order for that anime to be popular, it had to be mixed in with all these genre conventions and this self-serving fan service and these teenage this romantic notion of like, you know, self-pitying teenage angst that really detracts from the final work when you look on it again. And so it kind of hurts the vision. I would say it really hurts the vision of Evangelion when everything is said and done. And maybe they fix this in a different version of it somewhere. But this is the thing about the problem with anime, and it's the same problem with pornography. Pornography, or I guess before the present year, you know, in the 90s and the 80s and before then, right? Pornography, the thing with pornography was that it always presented itself as something else, right? Is that it always presented itself as like, oh, this is like most women who got revealing pictures shot of themselves. They were like, oh, this is art, this is art, this is art, but it was just porn, right? And so the problem with pornography, and romanticism has the same problem, is that when you incorporate it into your story, it starts taking it over because you're feeding your audience a drug. And so the drug always threatens to sort of take the entire work over and start impressing it into its own services, right? So what originally might have been a complex story about, you know, a young child and that being embodied through like this interstellar conflict, that kind of got colonized by this highly romantic escapade that is pure teen angst. And I think that's sort of what we have to deal with a lot of fanfic and with a lot of anime. It's that it's this constant struggle against the pornographic instinct of romanticism and sometimes pure pornography. And I don't know how to stop it. In some ways, I kind of miss the old decency standards because they limited the reach that kind of instinct could actually have. But I don't know. I don't have an exact solution for you, because the same people who are highly original in their 20s are also highly susceptible to these kind of meaningless masturbatory elements in art.
All right. Well, that's quite. I think that in itself was an artful sort of analysis of what's going on. I would say that it's it. I mean, you know, this wasn't meant to be a black pilling about anime, but
I think there's some good ones out there. You know, I mean,
I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not going. Hey, I'm someone who
I have to talk about that. If you want to talk about anime, maybe I can come on again.
I mean, I wasn't going to talk about anime, actually. Yeah, that just sort of took over like the romanticism of anime does.
Well, it's indicative, and obviously, we're probably winding down now, but it is indicative of a barrier, right? And the barrier is young people's imaginations have been colonized by pornography, romanticism, and progressivism. And those three things are not separable. Pornography, romanticism, and progressivism are all one of the same type of thing. They're incredibly addictive. They're incredibly appealing to young people. And so much of our efforts to get good art is to get people to think beyond those three things and to try to go towards hard realities and to try to go towards the secret tragedies of life and to reveal something that's deeper. And I don't know how to do that, because at this point we're just blasting our young people with with these three things, and I guess I think maybe there'll be an alternative that emerges from the right that people will be attracted to.
That is something I hope for, and I also hope that that somebody will. I mean, at some point, this will end up being stale, and this will end up being stale. I mean, even some leftists are saying that this is getting a little stale. This is getting a little overhyped, and we want to. I guess one of the things that I'll leave off on is, I've seen like my mother, who is somebody who is very much not a millennial. She's like, I think she was like a Gen X, a teenage. She was a teenager when Reagan was president, and she always, when I talk to her about wanting to write more realistic or tragic elements for my stories, she kind of looks down her nose on the idea, because she says that you have to have if you write something that's tragic or realistic or dark like that, then that says something negative about yourself. That says something negative about you, that you have that darkness inside of you. And you want to spread that to other people and not make other people uplift other people.
Well, I mean, tragedy can be overused, but realism cannot. There are things that are too on the nose tragic. We call them. I mean, in some sense, anything that's gothic is overusing the tragic dimension, but I think gothic can be good. But there's one thing that can't be overused, and that's realism. So I don't know. I'd say just stick to the realism of we're experiencing a very tragic moment in American history as we speak.
Definitely. All right. So I think that's going to be a good stopping point. I
Right?
really I really liked this conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I really hope that maybe one day we'll look back on this conversation and it'll be the start of something, a larger conversation on the right about art.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping.
Well, thank you
Uh,
very much for having me on. I have to go now, though. Thank you.
all right. We'll be signing out, and goodbye.